Well, good morning. I'm Sandy Farlow, your worship associate. Welcome to Community Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm glad you're joining us here for worship this morning in the sanctuary or online, or perhaps even later on YouTube. This last day of the big midsummer holiday is challenging for churchgoers and their families, so we will be pleased however you find us. Here at Community UU Church, our mission is nourishing spirits, working for justice, and transforming lives. We seek to examine spiritual questions individually and together, and the pursuit of personal and shared truths. We strive to serve and work together to make our world more compassionate, just, and respectful. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your journey, you are welcome among us. Our speaker today is a man well known to us, and lucky us that we call him friend, Bill Holston. Bill currently serves as executive director of the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center. There is an excellent article in the current Texas Monthly about the work that they do there. We put a link on our Facebook page, or you can find it on texasmonthly.com. It's entitled The Eviction Cure, and it's kind of about your boss, isn't it? Yeah, but they do talk about Bill and his outrageous bow tie, just so you know. Bill traditionally speaks to us in January and July about his work in many difficult and weighted areas, whether it be racism or immigration rights or poverty issues. He's a guy that doesn't give up on the pursuit of justice and a good beer, just so you know. We come from many places, along different paths, bringing different truths. We come with different histories and different realities, and yet we come together as one people, with faith that we can use our differences to heal ourselves and each other, to bring wholeness to a fractured world. We come seeking to find community, to find acceptance of who we are. In this place, we may find others who are much like us and others who are much different. We are a people taught by different stories with many voices, but always one people working for a world where love creates justice. Angel Dillon is our Chalice lighter this morning.
Flame of our faith, call us into the community of love and justice. If ever there were a time for a candle in the darkness, this would be it. Using a spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice.
In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus describes 9 Beatitudes, which are theological principles beginning with the initial words Beatitudes, blessed are, and naming deeply valued human qualities and experiences. A retired Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Lindi Ramsden, developed her own set of Beatitudes using that same sentence format, but intended for people who are justice builders. That's us. That's a commitment of UUs everywhere. Please join me in our responsive reading. Your part is in bold on the screen. Blessed are you who can question your own assumptions and listen with an open mind.
You will receive no insights beyond your imagining.
Blessed are you who suffer the attacks of others to stand up for what is right.
You will not be alone, for your courage will inspire others to rise.
Blessed are you who build friendships as well as justice.
Even when you lose an issue, you will strengthen the foundation of your community.
It's like Molly Ivins, isn't it? Blessed are you who lead with enthusiasm and confidence, resisting the temptation to shame the apathetic or self-absorbed.
You will inspire curiosity and hope in others.
Blessed are you who do not demonize your opponents.
Your eyes and your hearts will be open.
Blessed are you who play as well as you work.
You will have more fun, build more energy, and draw the powers of the impish to your cause.
I like to think I'm impish, and I'm pretty sure Lindi Ramsden is too. And I definitely know you are. Blessed are you who sing and dance. Blessed are you who discover, train, and encourage young leaders.
You will see your work expand and grow beyond your own time and talent.
Blessed are you who can change your mind.
You are so alive.
Blessed are you who will not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
You will see progress in your lifetime.
Blessed are you with an active spiritual life.
You will find perspective and comfort in times of loss and betrayal, and you will rise without cynicism to meet the challenges of a new day.
Blessed are you who live from a place of gratitude.
You will live in the name of God.
Reading today is a poem by Langston Hughes, I Dream a World. I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth and every man is free, where wretchedness will hang its head and joy like a pearl attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world. Good morning.
Good morning.
Cornel West wrote, "Justice is what love likes in public." On May 4th, 1989, a 13-year-old boy was tried and convicted for rape as an adult in the state of Florida, based on very, very shaky witness ID and the testimony of older boys who were more likely the perpetrator. Florida law permitted a sentence of life without parole. And so this 13-year-old intellectually challenged young man was going to die in prison. 18 years later, a fellow inmate reached out to Brian Stevenson, who is the founder of the Equal Justice Institute. Mr. Stevenson is an attorney who has dedicated his career to fighting against mass incarceration and the death penalty. And in fact, this was, in effect, a death sentence for this young man because he was going to die in prison, and he was all of 14 years old. And so Brian Stevenson and his fellow attorneys decided to challenge the constitutionality of this sentence as a cruel and unusual punishment, which is prohibited by our Constitution. And then EJI filed cases in Alabama, Missouri, Michigan, Iowa, Mississippi, North Carolina, Arkansas, Delaware, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and South Dakota, because all of these states had similar laws. He argued this case in the United States Supreme Court, another United States Supreme Court. And in 2010, the court declared that life without parole for children under 18 was cruel and unusual punishment. And then 2 years later, and this was for non-homicide offenses, and then 2 years later, they declared it unconstitutional for homicide defenses as well. And as a result of that, hundreds and hundreds of boys and girls received new sentences and were spared dying in prison. So this is a great illustration of what a single lawyer with a vision for justice can accomplish. Now, it was, of course, not easy. Now, I urge you, if you're not familiar with Bryan Stevenson, I commend to you this book, Just Mercy. How many people have read this book? A few of you, good. This is an excellent book, one of the most inspiring books. I'm going to give this copy to one of the young lawyers I work with who's waiting for his bar results, because it's extremely inspiring. Bryan Stevenson might be the best public speaker I've ever heard. He's, unlike me, he's subtle in his presentation, but he's a very, very passionate advocate for justice. And the thing that I think is really noteworthy about him is, as much as he's accomplished as a lawyer arguing death penalty cases and freeing people from prison, he's also moved into the area of education and advocacy. So he was the EJI, founded the Legacy Museum, which is perhaps the most powerful museum I've ever been to in Montgomery, Alabama, which tells the story of enslavement from 1619 through mass incarceration in the present day, as well as immigrant detention centers. It's a museum designed by lawyers because it makes this beautiful, brilliant argument about mass incarceration from beginning to end. And then, of course, the Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is his memorial to the victims of lynching. And you may have seen pictures of that museum that has these columns with the names of people who have been lynched all over the United States. And there are two columns I made a note of this, there were two columns there, one from Dallas County, Alabama, which is Selma, where my ancestors lived in the state of Alabama, and the other one, Dallas County, Texas, where, of course, we had two lynchings, at least, that occurred here, both of which now are commemorated with EJI emblems. And so it's important to pause for a minute and reflect on the idea that this attorney who was so effective in the courtroom moved into advocacy. And I think that any good lawyer who is doing real justice work, pro bono work, working for people who can't afford to pay simply for the establishment of justice, it inevitably leads you to advocacy. I know that it happened in my own case. You know, I've said this before. I didn't set out to be a human rights lawyer. I just said yes to a single case, an asylum case back in the 1980s for a Guatemalan woman, and helped this young woman obtain asylum. Her husband had been assassinated by a death squad in Guatemala. And then I said, oh, give me another one of those cases. That's really pretty interesting. And then I did that for 25 years. And I'm not going to minimize that work. It was transformative for the people that I represented. But even maybe more significantly, it was transformative for me, because doing that work and meeting people and hearing their stories and going to court with them, getting to know them as individuals, just really forced me to see them as people. And so that led me to advocacy around immigration. Because when people, fascists like the government of our state, attack immigrants, that's a personal fight for me. Because they're fighting people I know and respect. And so that's where that passion comes from. Now, over time, I developed a passion, not just, and I was very, very passionate, as you can see, still am, about immigration. But over time, what I really became passionate about was access to justice. The idea that we are a country, what do you say? We always say this, we are a country with the rule of law. You see this over and over. You hear this over and over. The founder of the DEAC, Mark Melton, he says this. He says, America say that we are a nation with the rule of law, and it is a myth. And then he lets it sink in, and he says, unless you have a competent attorney. And that is absolutely true. We have these laws. They're there, they're written, sometimes very plain language, other times not so much, which is where the lawyers come in. But if you go to court with an attorney, you know, people do it all the time. They have thousands, millions of dollars to pay banks of lawyers. And They can prevail because of that, because of the brilliance of the legal strategies they pursue. Not always. Sometimes they lose anyway, thankfully. However, if you don't have access to an attorney, your chances of success are really pretty close to zero. And the more complex the matter, the more true that is. Immigration, certainly true. If you don't have a lawyer and you're going through the immigration system, some people manage to navigate it successfully, but most do not. Now, you've heard it many times in the Miranda warnings on cop shows, you have a right to counsel. Well, that's in a criminal case. In a criminal case, because you're going to be deprived of your liberty, you have a right to counsel. Many, many, many other extremely important areas of law, immigration being one, eviction being another, you don't have a right to counsel. Well, you have a right to counsel if you can afford it. Well, let's see, how many of you think that somebody facing an eviction has the ability to pay a lawyer? Right. If you could pay a lawyer, you would pay your rent, right? I mean, so that's it. And so what had happened for many, many decades is that the wheels of justice round right over people who could not afford to pay their rent. And landlords routinely violated the law. Now, tenants, I said this last time I spoke, tenants have almost no rights here in the state of Texas. They do in other states, but here they have very few rights. But what small number of rights tenants had, landlords ignored. And why is that? Because the judges let them by with it until they were held accountable. And that's what our founder envisioned, was that we're going to hold landlords accountable for complying with the law. And guess what happened? Some landlords watched that and wanting to win, they started changing their behavior and complying with the law. And so over time, it's our hope as an organization that we will be in every eviction court in Dallas County, and we will hold not just the landlords, but the courts accountable for following the law. Thank you. So that's the good news, right? We have people like Brian Stevenson, people like Mark Melton, people like the lawyers at the Human Rights Initiative. Shalana Bowie spoke to you a few weeks ago about that. These are lawyers that have dedicated their careers to fighting people without regard to whether or not they can afford to pay or not. And that's a beautiful thing. It's an impressive thing. I think HRI, they did something like $3 million with the pro bono lawyers did something like $3 million with the free legal services for people who had absolutely no ability to pay. That's great. It's something worth celebrating. However, it is not nearly enough. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today is the justice gap. The gap between the legal needs of people who can't afford to pay and the available lawyers for them. So big law firms here in this, well, I'll say first of all, most lawyers don't do pro bono work. Now, the ones that do a lot. I was in the pro bono college every year of my practice for, I think, something like 15 years, which was, I did hundreds of hours worth of pro bono work every year. And a lot of lawyers do that. And so I get a little defensive when people talk about lawyers disparagingly. I know you would never do that, but some people do. And because lawyers actually do quite a bit. But again, it is not enough. And why is that? Well, it's because lawyers are just like everybody else. They have their own priorities. They have their own needs, maybe a bass boat or a big house or, a fully vested 401k. And so working for free is not going to pursue any of those goals, right? So I want to talk about some statistics about that justice gap. And all these come from a law review article called The Justice Gap, the Unmet Civil Legal Needs of Low-Income Americans. Well, about 50 million Americans have household incomes below 125% of the poverty threshold. And people making more money than that are still in poverty. But this is the official definition of poverty. And so how many of those people have legal problems, do you think? Okay. First of all, despite the fact low-income Americans have a lot of legal problems, they don't even try to get help for most of them. They say that only about 1 in 4 problems do they even seek assistance for. And then those who do not seek legal help, they say that the cost is the primary factor. And then 92% say that they do not get any or enough legal help for 92% of the problems that they have. So these are, of course, many times life-threatening. It may not be that you're going to go to jail, but someone who loses an asylum case and has to go back to a death squad in Eritrea, that's a death sentence. Somebody who is facing an eviction where they're going to be put out of their apartment where their medicine is and where their life-saving medical equipment is and their children are going to, may not be a death sentence, but it's definitely a threat to people's health and a threat to their life. And so that's what's at stake in these legal problems that people have no ability to get help for. 1.9 million requests for legal help, and 1 in 2 of those requests were turned away. Well, how have we designed legal services for the poor in this country? The number one avenue that we've done that through is the Legal Service Corporation, which was created during the Nixon years, and it was very, very, very effective. The LSC represented prisoners, they represented people in school, they did advocacy work for justice, they represented migrant farm workers, and it was transformative. Well, it was transformative in a way they didn't anticipate, which was, what do you think happened? All of those people were really, really mad that these poor people now had lawyers and they were losing cases, right? So what did they do? They put tremendous pressure on the federal government to kill the Legal Service Corporation. That was their desire in the Reagan years. Oh, you knew I was going to say the Reagan years, didn't you? In the Reagan years, they put tremendous pressure to end LSC. Now, they weren't successful, but they were able to trim its sails quite a bit by changing the rules. First of all, they put a lot of restrictions. When I say these are the organizations that went after LSC: the American Farm Bureau Federation, the so-called Christian Coalition, the so-called Conservative Caucus, the so-called Family Research Council, and the National Legal and Policy Center. These were very, very powerful lobbies that put tremendous pressure on the federal government. And so what they did is they changed the rules. Now LSC is prohibited from representing people who are undocumented. They're prohibited from representing prisoners. They're prohibited from doing class action lawsuits. They're prohibited from some of the policy work that they were doing before. Now, it's not that they're, and then here's the real rub. So most of the LSC funding was coming out of the federal budget, right? So these were federal dollars, but they changed the rules so that not only could the LSC funding not be used to do any of this stuff, none of their money could be used on any of this stuff. So even if they found funding from some other source to do that work, they still couldn't do that work because it was tied to the federal funding they did for entirely different work. So why would they do that, do you think? Greed, fascism, injustice. They had the money. Well, where the poor people's lobby? I mean, the rich people's lobby, they've got lots of money. Poor people's lobby, not so much. And so that is the state of the affairs today. We watch it every week. And this is why the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center is committed to only taking money without strings attached to them. We do not want a funder telling us who we can represent. So we watch them. And I hope you don't take Anything I'm saying is critical of Legal Aid of Northwest Texas. It is a great organization. They help thousands of people. It is not their fault that the federal government, that these people have taken aim at their funding and prohibited them from doing that work. They're as frustrated about it as I am. So it's not a criticism of them. It's a criticism of the system, because what's happened is people were going unrepresented. So Legal Aid had lawyers. They were going to court. They were setting up tables, but they could only represent a fraction of the people there. For instance, anyone who's undocumented, and they have to ask those questions. And once they said, well, I'm sorry, we just can't help you, there was no one there to help them until Mark Melton started the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center. And then, because of our commitment to taking unrestricted dollars, we are able to represent anyone and everyone. So I think I mentioned this last time. The way we work is we made signs that say, free attorney for tenants. Big signs. We put them up on a tripod in the lobby of the courthouse. We set up tables and we go around. We have legal assistants, including bilingual legal assistants, and they go around and say, hey, do you need a lawyer? We are free lawyers to represent you in court today. Do you want our help? Yes, and we represent them right then. And so sometimes we only have a few minutes because we're signing people up right up until when the court starts. So when Mark first started, he was getting clients in the courtroom. So he was in the courtroom arguing cases, and people would be walking up to the podium, and they were going to lose without a lawyer, even if they listened to him and parroted the exact same legal argument he made. They lost anyway because they weren't represented by counsel. And he was grabbing those people in the courthouse and say, hey, I'm going to represent. He would sometimes not even know their name. He would go and argue that case, and successfully. Well, some of the judges didn't like that. They stopped us from soliciting. They called it solicitation, or barratry, which is unethical. It's unethical to solicit lawyers. We're like, well, we're not soliciting people who are paying us. We're soliciting people to represent for no fee at all. So it's not real solicitation. And but we see it every day. As I mentioned, legal aid lawyers are sitting there at their tables, and they're representing a fraction of the people we do. So what's been the result of that? So we've represented just this first 6 months of 2024, 3,428 households. Yeah, of people. And this year, we're on track to represent 8,000 households. And that's with a staff. Yeah, I'm very, very proud of us. And so we started collecting the Our intake is a single sheet. It's a very, very simple process. It's like their name, their demographic information, and then we added an income line. Not because we were going to screen for income. We're going to represent 100% of people, even if they're the very few people that we thought might be above poverty guidelines. We're going to represent them anyway, because they're still in a situation where they can't pay their rent and they're facing an eviction. But we started collecting that information, and we found out that only 15% of our clients are over 200% of poverty guidelines, which is actually not surprising because of what we talked about earlier. If you could afford an attorney, if you could afford to pay your rent, you do pay your rent. With one exception, which I mentioned the last time I spoke to you, is people think that the condition of the property is a defense to eviction, which it is not. And so it's a very one-sided street. The landlord does not have to give you decent housing in exchange for your money, but you have to pay the rent anyway. And so we do occasionally run across people who really could have afforded to pay their rent, but they stopped paying their rent because of how the landlords have been ignoring their requests to get their air conditioner fixed or their lighting fixed or to do something about the mold or the leaking pipes or all that. And then once we tell them, no, I'm sorry, that's not a defense, it's too late because they've already breached their lease and they're facing an eviction. But we found out that a very high percentage of our clients are African American, a very high percentage of our clients are children, and that's pretty typical for eviction cases all over. So who are these people? So we just asked our staff, so okay, tell us about something that is particularly noteworthy about your work. And one of our new lawyers said, about 2 months into working here, I was able to represent 31 people in one day. Another one, she says, I was representing an elderly woman and her grandson whose daughter had been murdered in a murder-suicide only a month or so before, and she was able to get that eviction case thrown out. Another lawyer said a dismissal for a dialysis patient who was being evicted by the landlord who bullied her for months. Another lawyer said, 4 days I spent in Precinct 1, I represented over 60 tenants and had less than a handful of evictions. And we go on and on. So I want to say two things and then I'll close. First of all, one of the things that I've become we as an organization really conscious of. Our supervising lawyer, Stuart Campbell's a really great activist lawyer. And we started talking about the idea of resistance lawyering. And that is lawyering not just as an advocate for somebody in court, but being a part of a social movement of people. There's a great law review article written about resistance lawyering, a tradition that goes all the way back to abolition, when lawyers were representing people during the Fugitive Slave Act, but they were also combined with the community in opposing unjust laws. And so the idea of subversive lawyering or resistance lawyering is regular, direct practice of eviction defense within a procedural and substantive legal regime that is unjust. And so the only way for that to really be effective long-term is to work with community organizers to organize the community to resist the enforcement of unjust laws. So I'm going to end with a quote from Bryan Stevenson. He said this, and it's a great, uplifting quote. As in these dark days when we're trying to fight for the maintenance of the rule of law, it's important to hear about flickers of hope the people who are in this fight have. And he says, it seems like every time I've had to deal with the weight of injustice, there has always been a moment where mercy, where intervention, where grace, where redemption disrupted the weight of injustice and something happened. And I think that's been essential to my career. Thank you so much. It's always just a real joy to be here with you.
Thank you, Bill. 60 Minutes did a wonderful piece on Bryan Stevenson maybe a year or so ago. You can probably find it on YouTube. It's BRYAN Stevenson. And I suggest you watch that. It's incredibly moving. I have not been, my goal is to go to their facility and their museum. It's just to see what they do on television and to hear him talk about it is incredibly moving. The fourfold Franciscan blessing is a remarkable and challenging little prayer to end our service. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and turn their pain to joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. For all who see God, may God go with you. For all who embrace life, may life return your affection. For all who seek a right path, may a way be found. Go in peace and love.